Hey everyone. Greg and Magnar asked me to moderate this debate. Super excited to be here. I'm Andrew with Flightline Media. We post interviews of retired pilots, and I'm hosting a debate between Greg and Magnar. They're both successful airline pilots, and they want to debate on they want to have a debate on what the first airplane was, essentially. They both agree that the first practical airplane was the Wright Flyer 3, which flew on 23rd June 1905. But Magner challenges the prevailing narrative by exploring the definition of an airplane. He will also highlight important aviation pioneers' accomplishments often overlooked to include Clement Ader, Ludwig Prandtl, and Gustav Whitehead, just to name a few. Greg says the invention of the airplane is solely attributed to the Wright brothers, other than inspiration. Nobody before the Wrights had control, and so that's the side he is going to take here. So we're going to let Magnar go first. Each side's going to get about 7 minutes for an opening statement for their intro here. So, and then after that, we're just going to go back and forth, and I'll be here to either fact check or pull up photos or anything. So go ahead, Magnar.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. It's a humble experience for me to discuss this with Greg because he has much better knowledge than me. I feel like a gladiator who would say to the emperor, Moriturite salutant. Those who are about to die salute you, because I'm doomed to lose this debate. My opening argument is that the Wright Flyer flown on the 17th of December 1903 should not be considered to be the first successful airplane. I will start with a definition of an airplane. And according to ICAO, an airplane is an heavier than air aircraft with only two properties. It has fixed wing and power plant. And that I will talk about that a little bit later, how we can define this. But first of all, an airplane needs lift. And I will mention three pioneers who paved the way for modern aerodynamics. And the first was Sir George Cayley from the United Kingdom. He was the first to identify the forces of flight: lift, weight, drag, and thrust. And he built many gliders, including one that carried a human across a valley in 1853. And that was the first recorded manned heavier than air flight, even before the airships. Second, we have the German Otto Lilienthal. And he designed, built, and flew more than a dozen gliders. He made over 2,000 flights. He had a total flight time of His total flight time was about 5 hours. And he also provided aerodynamic data on wing shapes, and he influenced the Wright brothers. Number three, Octave Chanute. He designed and tested biplane gliders, and he introduced the strut and wire bracing system that was adapted by many pioneers, including the Wright brothers. He was also a mentor and communicator, and he shared knowledge with other pioneers, including Otto Lilienthal and the Wright brothers. So that was the first step. And when they understood lift, stability, and control, more or less, the next challenge was to find an engine that was light and powerful enough. And that took some time. As I said, ICAO's definition of an airplane only requires fixed wings and a power plant, and that gives room for interpretation. So I have added 5 requirements to the list. It should be manned, it should be controllable, it should be able to take off without assistance, it should be able to fly out of ground effect and maneuver freely, like making turns, and it should be able to land without getting damaged. The Wright Flyer of 1903 was manned. It had 3-axis control. but takeoff was only possible in cold air and into a headwind. It did not leave ground effect, but it could be flown again. But after the fourth flight, it was damaged. So this gives the flyer a score of 3 out of 5. And this achievement got little attention in the United States, and of course in Europe, nobody heard about it. There were many pioneers in Europe, and in more or less scientific ways, they tried to fly. The first one was the French pioneer Clément Ader. He designed steam-powered flying machines, and the first was Éolé. And it flew 50 meters on the 9th of October, 1890. If the criteria for an airplane are just fixed wings and a power plant, well, then this was the first aircraft to achieve flight. But checking against other 5 criteria, the machine was manned, it could not be controlled, it took off and on power, but it did not leave ground effect. Reportedly, he flew at 20 centimeters. And it landed in one piece. That gave it a score 3 of 5. Next, we have on the 23rd of October, 1906, Alberto Santos Dumont. He was a Brazilian living in France, and he flew his 14-bis airplane a distance of about 50 meters. And on the 12th of November, the same year, he flew 220 meters at a height of 6 meters. And he won an award set up by the French Aero Club. The aircraft was manned, and it was controllable in 3 axes. Not so much, but it was. It took off and on power, and it left ground effect, barely, but it could not maneuver freely, and it landed safely. So I give it a score 4 of 5. It took another 2 years before a French pilot, Henri Farman, became the first pilot to fly a controlled circular flight. Then, how about North America? There was one serious contender to the Wright brothers, and that was Samuel Langley, the secretary of the Smithsonian. And I think we'll discuss Smithsonian later here. On the 6th of May, 1896, he flew a 4th scale model of a machine he called the aerodrome for about 1,000 meters. In 1903, he tried to fly the full-size aerodrome and failed twice during launch, and the airplane crashed into Potomac River. In 1914, the aerodrome was modified and flown a few hundred feet by Glenn Curtiss. And the Smithsonian displayed the aerodrome in its museum and called it the first man-carrying airplane capable of sustained free flight. Okay, and then we have a controversial contender, Gustav Whitehead. He claimed I made many flights in 1901 and 1902. I will leave that story to Greg. So what about the Wright brothers? After the first flight in 1903, they built flyer number 2 in 1904. It had a more powerful engine, but it was very unstable in pitch and crashed many times. But at the best, it sustained flights up to 5 minutes and made full circles. In 1905 came Flyer 3, and it proved to be a significant improvement. They made it more stable, and it flew for more than 30 minutes. So in many ways, this was the first successful airplane and the first to receive the score 5 of 5. And with that, I leave the microphone to Greg.
All right, well, thanks very much, Magnar, and I'm very appreciative that you signed up for this debate. So many YouTubers out there make these big claims and then don't show up to back them up. And also thanks to Andrew for that introduction. So the Wright brothers invented the airplane. That's my take here. And not only that, I'm arguing that they discovered all of the secrets that had been preventing man from experiencing heavier than air flight for thousands of years. And I mean that literally. The Romans had the materials, technology, and building skills to create a glider. So did many other civilizations. They never did it because they could never figure it out. It's a common misconception that the Wright simply came along at the right time and finished what others had started. This idea that they stood on the shoulders of others is simply not true. The Wrights figured out and solved all of the key problems related to flight. These include the size and shapes of the wings needed to carry certain amounts of weight. Everybody else had that wrong. They figured out a control system that would allow for reliable, safe, and repeatable operation of the craft. Nobody before the Wrights came even close to understanding how to control an airplane. At best, they focused on stability. For example, Otto Lilienthal, who Magnar mentioned, a very famous pioneer, and he did a lot of great work. He would shift his body weight in an effort to control his glider. However, these efforts were in an effort to maintain a straight ahead glide, not to turn. In other words, if a wing dropped a little bit, he would try to bring it back up by shifting its weight. This is very different from what the Wright brothers were doing. They could not only do that, but they could drop a wing on purpose, keep it at the desired bank angle, and make a turn. The Wrights had actual control. The other pioneers, at best, had failed attempts at stabilizing their craft. In other words, the other pioneers were never close to being able to turn. They were just trying to hop straight ahead at very low altitude, typically only a few feet off the ground and only for a few seconds at a time. So the craft wouldn't be aloft long enough to fall out of control. And when it did fall, it would only be a few feet off the ground, so it would at least be survivable. The Wrights figured out that aircraft propellers had to have twist in the blades to work properly. This was a critical advancement for powered flight. Without it, engines would have to be much larger and heavier to generate a given amount of thrust. The Wrights also figured out, and this is important, how to learn to fly an airplane without killing themselves. They were well aware of the fact that even if they built a perfectly good airplane, flying it would require a certain amount of skill. Think of a bicycle. You might have a fine bicycle, but if you have never ridden one before, it's not likely you will be successful the very first time you try to ride it. Now imagine that first attempted bike ride as a life and death situation. That's what the early aviation pioneers were up against. Nobody before the Wrights truly solved any of these problems, and nobody before the Wrights figured out all of them. In fact, even in 1903, of the dozen or so serious efforts around the world to invent the airplane, all were fatally flawed for multiple reasons. I'm saying the Wrights invented the airplane, and I want to be clear about this because I'm not saying they were first in flight. The term flight is nebulous. A football flies, so does the General Lee. Some of you folks know what that is. Neither are airplanes. If we play loose with the definition of flight, then sure, there are examples of those things before the Wrights. People have been running downhill and jumping with homemade wings strapped to their backs for centuries. There have been man-lifting kites as well. You can argue that those are examples of flight, but not examples of airplanes. The definition discussion that Magnar brought up is kind of interesting. First of all, that ICAO definition, and ICAO is an international governing body that creates aviation regulations. It's a little bit different from the US FAA, which creates regulations in the United States. But both have definitions that are very similar. They just make a broad statement that if it's heavier than air, has wings, it's an airplane. Therefore, we have the ability to regulate it. In other words, that's their catch-all definition, so that no matter what somebody builds, the varying governing bodies can assert their dominance and regulation over it. I don't think that those definitions really equate to what we think of as an airplane in the practical sense. And Magnar agrees with me. He went through his definitions, but I'll just add that in the Cambridge Dictionary, the definition is a vehicle designed for air travel that has wings and one or more engines. Obviously, it's got to be controlled if it has air travel. And again, Magnar agrees with me on that. NASA has sort of a kids section where they describe airplanes in very simple terms, and they clearly make it clear that airplanes have controls. The definition in Merriam-Webster says powered heavier than air aircraft, fixed wings from which it derives most of its lift, but shows a picture of an airplane and points out all of the control surfaces. So I think Magnar and I have to agree that airplanes do have to be controlled. Now, as for all of these, I'm going to call pretenders to the throne, George Cayley and Octave Chanute and all of these others, I'd really rather go over those one at a time. Magnar mentioned so many of them that I'd frankly forgotten a lot of them already, and I'd have to talk for a significant amount of time on each one. So I'll turn this over to Magnar, my esteemed colleague. Which one of these do you want to talk about first? Be any of them. Cayley, Lilienthal, it's up to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, let's start with Lilienthal
Great,
because he influenced the Wright brothers.
certainly.
And he studied the wings of birds
Mhm.
to, so I also noticed he had some drawings. We also saw the twisting of the wing. So the angle of attack is higher at the wing root at the wingtip, for example, which is an interesting observation.
Mhm.
And he made observations and he wrote down data explaining lift by the numbers. And he flew a lot of different gliders, so he experimented a lot. And many say he was the first to fly a hang glider. Yes, but he had less control than a modern hang glider had today because a hang glider pilot is strapped below the wing, while he was inside the wing and can only move his legs back and forth, left, right. So he had limited capability to maneuver the wing. And also he flew from a hill, so he couldn't maneuver very much. His average flight was 9 seconds, which means it was very, very short. Yeah. So I think we can start with him because the Wright brothers, they got some information from his work, which they analyzed and concluded, that doesn't work, right?
Yeah, that's what they concluded.
Mm.
First of all, I like Lilienthal. You know, the guy did a lot of impressive work. He really did advance the idea that maybe man could fly, and he did serve as an inspiration to the Wright brothers. I agree with you about all of that, and also his what he said when he died is like apparently his final words, which are on his tombstone. Very German, but I thought it was just a really cool thing to say under the conditions. He said, "Sacrifices must be made." You know, making it clear that yes, he died in pursuit of this science, but in his view, it was ultimately worth it. He certainly inspired the Wrights. I would very, I certainly, I think he barely flew, and I wouldn't consider anything he built an airplane. It's certainly, as you pointed out, very different from a modern hang glider. He flew off of, you mentioned the hill he flew off of, but I think it's important to consider the dimensions of that hill. It was 15 meters high. We're going to use the metric system for this, and had a 60-meter diameter, so 30-meter radius. And on top of that 15-meter high hill was normally, not always, but normally a 4-meter high launching platform. In other words, he's launching from 19 meters, and to get to the bottom of the hill, he's got to go roughly 30 meters. Well, I did the math on this, and an Olympic long jumper can just about make it to the bottom of that hill. It's damn close. An Olympic long jumper travels just under 10 meters and at a speed at the end of the jump of just under 10 meters per second. If you do the math from there, they're more, depending on how they hold their body, you know, for maximum aerodynamics, they'll just about make it to the bottom of the hill. A lot of Lilienthal's flights were not much better than what an Olympic long jumper can do, except that Lilienthal's flights were more survivable. Obviously, in this case, the long jumper's not going to survive that, which means to me that Lilienthal had what was closer to a parachute than a controllable, flyable thing. I'm not saying it was a parachute, but it certainly wasn't anything like a modern hang glider. It wasn't anything like a modern airplane. It doesn't have wings like a modern airplane. The control surfaces you mentioned, that's interesting. Those were not in the glider that he produced. He produced the first glider that was in serial production, which I think he called, it was some very German name like Universal Flying Apparatus or something like that. But he did experiment with control surfaces, as you pointed out, on his experimental monoplane. I don't think either one of those were for roll control. There are two types of controls that he had on that I am familiar with, that I've seen drawings of and writings from Lilienthal on. And he had sort of leading edge devices that were held in place. They were held up by rubber band, or they were held down by rubber bands. And as airspeed would increase, they would retract, kind of like the leading edge slats on a Messerschmitt 109 or something. They're just mechanical in terms of operation. There's no mechanism other than rubber bands and airflow. And he very clearly states that that was to control the airplane in pitch. His concern was when the plane got too slow, he would lose control of it. And this would give him more pitch authority or would pitch the plane in the direction they needed to go. It wasn't about roll. The argument that Lilienthal had roll control comes from, I think, misreading of Lilienthal documents. He had these triangular looking things that were vertical, placed vertically out at the wingtips, and he could manipulate these. And what he says that those do is bring a wingtip forward, not up or down, which means yaw. So that's how I read that. And granted, there's a lot of issues here in that we're translating stuff from German and not modern German. And plus we have the further issue that aviation vocabulary was not around yet. So I'm willing to concede that I may be reading this a little bit wrong, but I read that those wingtip sails, and it's the name I'm making up for them, were for yaw control, and the leading edge devices that would extend and change the curvature of the wing, which is what they did, were for pitch control. I don't think he ever had roll control, but if he did, my greater point is that wasn't really to control the airplane. It was for stability. All of these early pioneers focused really hard on making the aircraft stable so it could continue to fly straight ahead, and never focused on actually maneuvering the airplane. And I think that's one of the things that held back development. As for his inspiring the Wrights lost almost a year in their development of the airplane because of information from Lilienthal and Cayley and everybody else. The Wrights, when they started, did what I think you or I would have done. It would have been the prudent thing. They gathered all the information they could. They contacted the Smithsonian, got everything they could get from them. They contacted Octave Chanute, who you mentioned, who was sort of a hub of aviation information, so to speak. He was collecting everything and being sort of the communication go-between. There was no internet, of course. Communication was much more difficult. People barely had telephones. Octave Chanute was sort of that information hub. And the Wrights gathered all of this stuff, and they couldn't get anywhere. If you look at the early Wright flyers, they have very short wings, very, very low aspect ratio wings, and they couldn't get them off the ground, and they couldn't figure out why. And once they finally started developing their own wings and doing their own testing, they realized everybody else had information that was just faulty. They did the right thing in terms of looking at what everybody else was doing. I certainly would have done that too, and you probably would have as well. But that information led them astray. And I want to also mention that when we're talking about wings, as far as I know, the Wrights were the only ones to come up with real systems for measuring the lift of a wing. I don't know of anybody else that had that. For example, Lilienthal's way of measuring lift was basically pencil and paper. He would do the math, and that didn't really work. The Wrights would do that, but they also built a wind tunnel to test wings, and they also tested full-scale wings, and they did this by one of two ways, which I think is very interesting. One way was they would put chains, which they knew the weight of these chains, onto the wing, and then fly the wing as a kite and see how much weight and chain it would lift. The other way they would do that, because I think they determined that the chains were disrupting the airflow over the wing. The other way they would do this is they would get fish scales from the market. People pay for fish based on the pound, so those scales are very accurate. They would get those scales, attach them to the ground, attach them to the wing, and see how much force the wing would generate when it was flown as a kite, see how much it would lift. I don't think you can name any other early pioneer that had any real way of measuring lift, let alone all three ways that the Wrights were doing. They were the ones that figured out that wings worked. Lilienthal's wings didn't really work. There are no airplanes today with wings that look like Lilienthal. In fact, I generally put these early pioneers into sort of one of three categories, and I think this will make sense to you. You've got the bird and the bat people, or in other words, the people that think that an airplane should look something like a bird or a bat. Lilienthal is in that camp. You have another very interesting camp that think that airplanes should be like a ship. It should look like a boat, for a boat hull for a fuselage, boat controls, meaning a tiller in the back for rudder and vertical, some sort of vertical action, and a sail like off a sailing ship, but presented horizontally as a wing. There are some exceptions though. George Cayley, he's a boat person. Octave Chanute was one of the people that really went away from that. So it doesn't need to look like that. And he went a different direction. And that sort of inspired the Wrights, I think, because the Wrights were not really, they were looking at birds, certainly. They were interested in birds, but they weren't designing their wings like a bird wing. Lilienthal was designing his wing like a bird wing. His math was off. That was all a dead end. The Wright wings were not a dead end. The Wright brothers' wings lasted well into World War I. In other words, that basic design. So Lilienthal, yeah, important guy. He did not contribute anything to the other than inspiration, and that's a big thing. I'm not saying it's of no value, but he didn't contribute anything to the Wright brothers and their development of the airplane. His wing design was nothing like what the Wrights did. Developed very little lift. I think its glide ratio, according to a German study I read, was 3.5 to 1. I've seen glide ratios published as 4 to 1. It was at least 6.5 to 1 for the Wrights early gliders, 1902 gliders. The Wrights were 50% ahead in that. I just don't see anything Lilienthal contributed here to the Wright brothers. Again, I'm not saying I'm not knocking out a Lilienthal. He did great stuff. I think the epitaph on his tombstone is amazing. But yeah, I'm not buying that he had any kind of effective 3-axis control. And most of his flights were, in terms of distance, what you can do without a flying machine.
Yeah, I think his wing was too small. He had too high wing loading compared to the efficiency of the wing.
Yeah.
A hang glider has a bigger wing area than he had.
Yeah.
So I think that was the problem for him, that I learned to fly hang glider at Colorado Rogallo wing. It had a ratio of 4 to 1, and you really needed a steep hill to start.
And what year did the Rogallo wing come out?
It come in the late 60s.
Yeah. Okay. So way after. I mean, Lilienthal's wing has nothing to do with the Rogallo wing that's used on a modern hang glider.
Yeah.
His control, I would argue, is not similar to a model. In fact, I'm going to ask Andrew to pull up a picture. I almost said Alexander. Sorry about that. I work with people.
Oh, you're good. After we pull up a picture, let's let Magnar have a minute too.
Yeah, that's great. Magnar has a lot of pictures of Lilienthal, which are great. In fact, I was probably just going to use the same ones. But let's pull up the second Lilienthal, Lilienthal 2, I think I named it.
You got it.
Or if you can't, I can just describe it.
There you go. Can you see it?
I just see a blank screen. Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, okay, you can leave that one up. That's the first picture. And now I want to state I am not 100% sure this is a legit picture. It's like it's almost too good to be true. It's out of a storybook, but it looks great, and I like the picture. And this shows Lilienthal. I believe the picture of Lilienthal and his craft, and this is the one that he put into serial production. I believe that's legit. I'm just not sure about that steeple and the stuff all in the background. But you notice Lilienthal's feet are at the extreme forward position. In other words, he's trying to pitch that thing down by shifting his weight as much as he can. He's at the limit of his control authority, and it's lack of control authority that was really the problem. And a lot of the pictures that show Lilienthal are like that. The other picture that I supplied of Lilienthal shows his legs in similar way. And there are several of them you'll see where he's got his legs as far back as they can go. Of course, they can't go back as far as they can go forward. But this is typical of Lilienthal stuff. He just doesn't have enough control. And in order to get enough control, the problem is you can't have enough wing area. In other words, when you make the wings big enough to give enough lift, then your shifting weight isn't going to be effective enough to control the airplane until you get into more modern times with the Rogallo wing and the system of suspending the pilot way below the wing. Anyway, I'll turn this over to Magnar and continue the Lilienthal action.
Yeah, I agree about that. You couldn't make it too big. I think the most important inspiration Wright brothers got, that Lilienthal showed, you can fly. You can make a glider.
Yes.
And also the wing profile, the earliest description of a cambered airfoil go all the way down back to Cayley. He described a wing. It has a very low aspect ratio. He also described a tail for control. So that was quite early. Chanute.
Wait, are you talking about Cayley right now or Lilienthal? I maybe misunderstood that. Did you switch from Lilienthal to Cayley?
Yep.
All right, well, let's talk about Cayley then. Yeah, please continue.
Yes, because he described a cambered wing, airfoil. He also described a tail surface for control. But his craft looked like a boat with a low aspect wing on the top, and then you have a steering with a kind of movable fin at the end. So that was his idea. And in a way, he also said it should be powered, but they didn't have engines in that 1850s.
I'll pull it up for you here, Magnar. Pull up the Cayley's invention here.
Yeah.
Perfect.
All right, it's my turn to respond to this.
Yeah, you can.
All right. I don't believe this thing flew at all. George Cayley created what at best was a governable parachute. In fact, that's the term used to describe it in an 1852 issue of Mechanics magazine, which is the source for most of what we know about his work. That article in that magazine and almost everything we know about Cayley's work comes from Cayley himself. The Wrights did look at Cayley's research, but a lot of it was wrong. For example, Cayley thought that on a curved wing surface, the center of pressure on the wing moved aft with an increase in angle of attack. It doesn't. It moves forward within the range of angles you could normally use when flying an airplane. Ironically, the center of pressure does move that way, the way Cayley described with a flat wing, but Cayley's wings had curvature to them, as Magnar mentioned. Everything the Wrights got from Cayley was wrong and actually slowed down their progress. In fact, one of the things that held back the Wright brothers, as I mentioned, was they started off trusting these so-called experts that came before them. Only after discarding what Cayley said and everything else they learned from these former pretenders to the throne and deciding only to believe their own testing or what their own testing could prove, did they start to make real progress forward. Now, Cayley's two claimed flights, and I'm going to be kind and I'm just going to grant that they did happen. These were at best uncontrolled short glides and were really just man-lifting kites, something the Chinese have had for way over 1,000 years. The first of the two flights, supposed flights, like I say, I'm going to grant that they happened. So the first of the two flights was in 1849. There are no specifics about this flight itself in terms of how it was launched, distance, or much else, only that it carried a 10-year-old boy, which is kind of interesting. Now, some sources say that it was tethered to the ground, and if so, and if that's all it ever did, then that's a man-lifting kite, not a glider. Best case, it rolled down a hill, became airborne for a short time, and then just plopped back down. Now, the second of the two flights was 4 years later in 1853, which I think casts some doubt on whether the first flight happened at all. You would not normally go 4 years between attempts or experiments, especially if the first one was successful. The second of these two flights happened in 1853. Not much is known about this flight either. It appears that it was simply towed to a high enough speed to climb in the air, much like running with a kite with a string. In no way were Cayley's crafts capable of any sort of controlled flight or even being sustained beyond what their towing system, horses, men, or whatever, could provide. They were not airplanes. They were not even gliders. They contributed almost nothing to the airplane we know it as we know it today, other than maybe the fact that it has a tail, but that's something that you could say was from birds or from boats. It was absolutely nothing new. Cayley's control system, such as it was essentially a tiller that could move up and down or left and right. Again, a tiller like you would have on a boat, except with a vertical component. Now, what Cayley did was inspire the Wright brothers. And in a sense, I would also say that, not to the extent Lilienthal did, but in a sense, Cayley founded the idea of using the scientific method to study aviation, but his efforts went nowhere. And certainly he didn't invent the airplane or even contributed to the cause. He didn't contribute to the cause in any meaningful way. And I also want to say that if Cayley really did fly, then why didn't anything happen after that? There were people selling shares of stock in airlines, believe it or not, around Cayley's time with the idea that man was on the cusp of inventing flight and people were going to be flying around all over the place. There was a lot of pressure on these early pioneers to get the airplane going. If Cayley had really made any progress or any traction, I think somebody else would have then built upon it because the demand was there. So I don't believe it happened. And even if those flights did happen, they didn't do anything for aviation. There's nothing on Cayley's craft you can look at and go, oh yeah, I see that on successful airplanes that from 50 years later. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I rest my case.
All right, well, I guess I do too. Who else do you want to talk about?
Should we go to
Chanut.
Albert? Want to go to Alberto Santos Dumont?
It's a little later. He suggested Chanute. I think that's a good idea. I
Sure.
think that's one we're going to agree on.
Yeah, because
I'll pull up Chanute here.
as I understand, he introduced the biplane with struts and wires, so you get a light structure. I think that was what he introduced, which was beneficial for many.
I'll pull it.
Yeah, my turn. I mean, I basically agree with that.
Here, I'm pulling it up here, guys.
Okay, that's a great picture. So, yeah, that's Octave Chanute on the left, and that's one of his gliders on the right. I'm not sure what's happening there, if he's been towed or ran with it and jumped off the hill or what. But as you can see, just by the wingspan, there's not nearly enough wing. There's not much cord to the wing either. He doesn't have any movable controls. It's another one shifting by moving his weight around, although at least he does have his whole body suspended below, so we can sort of get a little more motion into his body to maybe try and control it. But this never really flew. Octave Chanute himself does not claim that he invented the glider or the airplane. That's Mr. Chanute on the left there. He's an interesting guy. You know, he was the designer of a bridge. I live in Oklahoma. Kansas is one state to the north. There's a town in Kansas named after Octave Chanute, named Chanute, Kansas. He's a big deal. He was essentially an architect. He built bridges, and he did a really good job. And what he brought, and I know that because those bridges are still around today, and they have, you know, big, heavy trains going over them. So he was the real deal in the architectural world. And what he brought with him from his architectural world, once he retired from that, he got into aviation. He did come up with that structure you're looking at. And yeah, okay, I'll agree. The Wright brothers did take the basics of that as the structure for their airplane. So I guess he contributed that. But Chanute was not able to fly. In fact, when he met the Wright brothers, he was very impressed with them, but he was impressed with them for the wrong reasons. He was impressed with them for their skill and craftsmanship, and he wanted the Wrights to work for him to build his designs, but the Wrights realized that his designs were a dead end. You know, again, it's all about control, and he didn't have any way of controlling these things. The Wrights got along with Chanute. They corresponded with him, and they certainly got information from it, but most of it was wrong, except maybe the structure, the basic way of building that that biplane structure. Maybe the Wrights got that from Chanute. It kind of looks that way, but Chanute himself was never anywhere near flying. And another interesting thing about Chanute, when the Wrights explained to Chanute what they were going to do, how they wanted to control their 1902 glider, they sent him this long explanation explaining how they were going to change the shape of the wings for roll control and elevator and rudders. They put all their cards on the table for Chanute and showed him exactly what he was going to do and gave him the dimensions of the glider. And Chanute's response was, well, your wingspan's too great to be able to control this by shifting your weight around. And the Wrights are like, you know, the old timer just didn't get it. He just didn't understand what the Wrights were trying to do. And the Wrights sort of dissolved their relationship with Chanute. They were friendly with him, but they stopped giving him too much information, which actually resulted in some interesting things. Chanute spoke French. I think his parents were from France, or maybe he immigrated from France when he was very young. I'm not sure about that. But in any case, he spoke French. And he went over to France and met the, I can't think of the name of it, but the French Aero Club that Santos Dumont, all those guys were part of. And he went over there and he gave a presentation on the Wright brothers and explained everything the Wright brothers were doing. But he got that all wrong, partially because the Wrights had stopped giving him all their latest info. So then in France, in fact, Santos Dumont built a Wright designed glider, or he built a Wright designed glider as Octave Chanute saw it. So it wasn't right. It didn't have the right wingspan, didn't fly. And that was part of the reason the French were absolutely anti-Wright brothers for a while. They thought the Wrights were a bunch of charlatans because they had built what they thought were accurate Wright designs and didn't fly. So Chanute's really interesting guy. You know, it's the kind of guy that'd probably be really fun to have a cup of coffee with. And he certainly knew structures and from all his time as an architect. And that's why he came up with those wings. That did work. Yeah, I'll certainly grant that, okay, Chanute maybe contributed. Yeah, I'll grant that. Yeah, I'd say Chanute contributed that structure. You know, he was one of the ones that wasn't one of the bird people or the bat people or the boat people. And so, yeah, okay, I'd say, yeah, the Wrights got that from Chanute. But
Yeah, because
only
Canute
that.
was an engineer, so he understands structures
Mm-hmm.
and he understands how to make it light and rigid enough to stay together. Yeah.
He did, just couldn't make it fly.
Yeah. And also in France, many adopted that design, like Farman, for example,
Mm-hmm.
which become used widespread.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, Chanute.
Mm.
I would say that Chanute contributed that. I'm not sure that the Wright brothers wouldn't have come up with that same idea on their own. They were certainly looking at biplanes. They were looking at connecting things that way. They had built a lot of stuff. You know, this was not the airplane was not the Wright brothers' first rodeo. So, but yeah, I will certainly concede the Wright brothers' early gliders up through really all of their airplanes, at least up through 1905. You know, they built a lot of airplanes after that, but at least up through 1905, the basic structure of the wing does look like Chanute. I think Chanute is the one that came up with that.
Yeah. But going back to the Wright brothers,
Uh-huh.
the initial issue was the stability in the pitch.
I'm
Because,
not sure what you mean by initial. I mean, to me, the initial issue is getting off the ground, but okay, go on.
yeah. But once they flew,
Yeah,
they made 4 flights on the 17th of December.
sure.
And every landing was not intentional because they were struggling to keep the aircraft flying in pitch. And
Well, that's
also,
true. Okay, go on.
flyer number 2 had the same issue. And they thought they could solve the problem moving the center of gravity aft, which made it worse. So flyer 2 was not a good solution either. But number 3, they enlarged the control surfaces and they put them further away from the wing. And suddenly it worked.
Yeah. And I think that's what you would expect from somebody that invented the airplane. You know, I mean, to use a human term, you know, we've all seen a baby take its first steps. It doesn't, you know, pick up the football and run into the end zone, you know, for a touchdown. The Wright brothers, you're sort of starting the story in the middle, by the way, when you mentioned the Wright Flyer 1 in 1903. The Wrights, for purposes of this discussion, I would say built 3 different gliders and 3 different powered airplanes. And you mentioned the 3 powered airplanes. The first gliders didn't have enough wing because they were listening to everybody else. The second glider had enough wing, but they didn't have adequate control surfaces because they didn't understand adverse yaw, and that absolutely will prevent you from flying. If you have something that barely flies anyway, and you get adverse yaw, you know you're not flying past that. So the third glider flew, and it flew as long as it flew about 45 seconds. Now that glider flew in 1902. I believe the 45-second flight was later in 1903. It flew for some less amount of time, 25 seconds or whatever it was in 1902. But that glider is really where the story gets going, because that is the glider that proved all of their concepts work. They could keep it in the air for a significant amount of time. I mean, 45 seconds, if you sit here and count, you know, 1 to 45, and you're in the air with something that's brand new in the world, that's a long time. And they had control of it. Yeah, I mean, you know that. And so to me, that Wright glider, their third glider, is really where the story takes off, no pun intended. And that is the glider that they based their patent on. People seem to think that the Wright patent is based on that December 17th flight, that airplane. It's not. The Wright patent was filed in 1903 after they had had really good success with that glider, because that's the point at which they knew for sure that all of their stuff was working. Their wing design was working. Their controls were working. They thought it was going to be very easy to just put an engine on it. But then they found out, of course, that nobody really made an engine that was right for that. They had to make their own engine. And they also found out, they thought that they would just take boat propellers and redesign them, considering factoring in the compressibility of air, because water is functionally not compressible and air is. And then they learned there was hardly any science out there on propellers. People, the boat people were just, the real boat people, not the airplane boat people, were just using trial and error and didn't really have very efficient props. So the Wrights had to almost create a new science for propellers. So that's why there was a big delay between their glider, and it took them almost a year from the time that glider worked till the time they flew in 1903. And I certainly concede that that 1903 flyer is not a very good airplane, but I want to point out that's how things are in the human experience. Nobody does something perfectly their first time out. That glider failed to fly on, I believe it was December 14th, 3 days earlier. When it flew on the 17th, they thought that the reason it was is because they just got better at flying. They were considering the human aspect of the operation of the glider. They didn't know, and they couldn't have known, that the reason the flyer flew on that day and only on that day is because the density altitude was very low. For those of you viewing, density altitude means that a low density altitude, this is a little bit counterintuitive, but a low density altitude means you have very dense air, usually because of low temperatures or high atmospheric pressure in the case of that day on December 17th, both. So they had very low air temperature, very high pressure, very dense air, which gave the engine a little bit more power and enabled the craft to lift off the ground at a little bit of a lower speed. And it went down its launching rail, which was not very long, was maybe twice the length of the craft's wingspan. It was a very simple thing. It was basically a board put on its side. And they got off the ground. I'm not sure I would say that they had to have a headwind to get off the ground. You mentioned that. I don't know how we would know that. If it's able to reach an airspeed and move forward in the air, I think it would be able to reach that on the launching rail. I've never seen any study or anything showing otherwise, saying that they had to have a headwind to get off the ground. I will certainly agree they had to have a headwind to get off the ground within the distance of the launching rail, but they could build a longer launching rail. I mean, it's not like they were out there trying to pave a new runway. The launching rail was a pretty simple thing. It did it fly? Yeah, it flew. It just didn't fly very well. I think the longest flight that day was 59 seconds, which again is a long time. And that was the last flight. The thing was destroyed by high winds. It got flipped over or something, after they parked it and were kind of done for the day. So when they went back to Ohio, they just built a new airplane because, as you know, when you're trying to figure things out, you learn as you go, and there were new things they wanted to do anyway. So they just built a whole new airplane, which was the Wright Flyer 2, which had a lot of improvements, but not, as you pointed out correctly, not enough. Now, right, they still didn't understand this density altitude problem, and one of the funny things is they called a lot of people to have the press come and witness them fly in May. I think it was May. In any case, of springtime in 1904. But the density altitude, and again, they didn't know that, was something like 4,000 feet above sea level. They were in Ohio and in the summertime or spring anyway, and it was a hot day. And Wright Flyer 2 wouldn't get off the ground. And this was in front of the press. I mean, this is a big deal. They were very disappointed. Now, a number of people have speculated, and I think this is incorrect, but there is a lot of speculation out there that the Wrights intentionally failed to fly in front of the press in the spring of 1904 to prevent other people from stealing their invention. I don't think that's it. I think that the density altitude riddle was just really getting them. They didn't fly that plane successfully until a little bit later, but by the end of 1904, they were able to take off and fly that plane for several minutes at a time and make 360-degree turns and land back where they started. And that was witnessed by the press. And there is a magazine report where the writer, who was somebody knowledgeable on flight and science, published it. And interestingly, it's actually published in like a beekeeping magazine or something, but I have that article. They did fly the Wright Flyer 2 successfully in 1904, and that was not a good flying airplane. But again, like a baby learning to walk, or like you learning to ski, or anything in the human experience, you're not going down that mountain on a double diamond run the first time you're out skiing. And so it was the third Wright Flyer, and you mentioned that. I think we're in 100% agreement. That's the first actual practical airplane. You could have a Wright Flyer 3 and take off and fly around until it runs out of fuel, which is nominally an hour. That's the first practical airplane. But because that's the first practical airplane, I don't think that we can then just dismiss everything that came before it. The things that came before it were the baby steps needed to get to that. And that's another big difference between the Wrights and all of these pretenders to the throne. You can see those steps. You can see the Wrights did that. These other candidates took one or two steps, fell, and never got up again in most cases. There are some exceptions to that. Lilienthal, he flew a bunch of times. Clement Adair, whatever his name is, you mentioned him earlier. I think that guy's. I'm going to go back to that for a minute. I think that's a bunch of nonsense too. He supposedly flew. How far did he say he flew?
50 meters.
50 meters, and how high off the ground?
A foot.
Yeah, 20 centimeters is what you said, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's not a foot. It's maybe 8 inches. So, but I know a metric system, American measurements aren't
Yeah,
your thing, but I get it. Eight
yeah.
inches. Can you
Mm.
pull up a picture of that contraption, Andrew?
Yep, one sec here.
Clement Ader.
Yes, I can. Photo of it is right here.
Well, I don't think there's a photo. Well, actually, there are photos of it.
Do you want a drawing of it here? I got a
Whatever.
There
Yeah,
is
it's
a
either one's fine.
drawing for the flight. Yeah.
cool. Let's share this
Well,
drawing.
there's no photo of the flight. There's a drawing. So this
Yeah,
thing
there's
is
a
steam.
drawing of the flight.
Yeah, okay. This thing is steam powered. It's got one propeller up front, and I'm mentioning that because there's a later one that has two steam engines.
Yeah.
And first of all, the idea of steam powered flight is pretty extreme. There's no really proven passenger carrying steam powered airplane until the 1930s, and that was in a Travel sort of picture a Fokker D7 with two cockpits, and that's what you'd have.
Yeah.
So this thing has no control surfaces on it. So you're telling me, I just want to, I mean, I'm asking actually both of you guys, you're pilots. You're telling me that the operator of this, let's just call him a pilot, the pilot of this craft had sufficient control, yet with no flight controls, to hold an altitude of 8 inches for 150 feet. I doubt you can hold, and you're one of the most experienced pilots in the world, Magnar. I doubt you can hold an altitude of 8 inches for 150 feet in an airplane you've flown a whole bunch. Now, helicopter guys can do it. Different breed of cat. They push tennis balls around with the skids and stuff. But fixed wing airplane, holding it 8 inches off the ground with no controls by shifting your weight for 150 feet or 150 meters, whatever it is. I don't believe that happened. I believe what happened is he got this thing rolling and it maybe lifted off the ground 8 inches and then fell back down and bounced and went up maybe 8 inches. The fact that it only got off the ground 8 inches sounds to me like it was bouncing up and down as it's going down the runway. I don't believe this thing lifted off and was at 8 inches for that distance. I don't believe that any pilot today would be able to do that effectively. It's very hard to control altitude to the inch, as anybody who's flown an airplane knows.
Let's go back
There
here.
was no controls on this.
Yes.
They
Let's
say
get back.
that
Let me give
controls.
you, Magnar, hold on. Let me give you just a sec here. Do you want to revisit anything on the Wrights? And then after that, we can go to Clement Ader. But do you,
Yeah, we don't have to discuss him a lot. People in Toulouse are very proud of him because he was living there, and Toulouse is a hub for aviation. I've been
It
there a
is.
lot. So they really embrace him for what
I
he
get
did.
it. I don't believe this first thing flew. The second thing definitely didn't fly. I mean, nobody claims it flew until Clement Adler, like 30 years later, some great amount of time later, claimed the second one flew, but there's no evidence of that. And the third one, when the French authorities who were paying for this party, because he was not an independent investor like the Wright brothers, he was somebody who was being paid to do this by the French government. And when they showed up to check on his work, they pulled the funding and canceled the contract. I don't think they would have done that if anything he made actually flew. So I don't, yeah, that's a drawing. It's a great drawing. And again, that's the first one, the one where he supposedly flew 8 inches for some distance. I have serious doubts as to whether that happened. I think it was rolling downhill, powered by its steam engine, and hit some bumps and bounced into the air a few times. And I think that's about it. In any case, there's nothing on that thing that is representative of what you see on an airplane. Not the propellers, not the engine, not the wings, certainly not the controls. It doesn't have that. And in fact, even the wings, and a lot of these early wings, when you look at them, they have their spars, so to speak, external to the wing. They're running out lateral reinforcements running out below the surface of the wing, which no airplane flies like that. There's no wings in aviation, not once aviation really started, which I would say 1908. Nobody's building wings like that. Those are going to disrupt the airflow like crazy. But you see those on a lot of these early airplanes, and his are an example of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it didn't flew well. And his third aircraft didn't even manage to take off. It was damaged during an attempt. So it was not very successful, but got to France, and they will argue against it.
I get it. I understand the French, think it's great. I mean, A for effort and A for getting, a government grant to throw a bunch of money his way. But that didn't result in an airplane. My take on that is if I was French, I'd be like, well, rather they have put that money into something else.
Mm.
Magnar, I want to ask this before we go to the next guy. Do you have Greg? Greg took a lot of time talking about the evolution of the Wright's inventions from their three gliders to their three Wright flyers. Do you have anything that you want to add about that, or any insights you want to share on the evolution of the Wright's aircraft?
I think he covered it very well. And the important thing is he mentioned adverse yaw, which they discovered, and that led to they added the rudder. I think that was one very important discovery they made, because without they experienced, they couldn't control the glider when they're banking, because they get more drag on the wing that went down. So, sorry, that went up. So they understood they needed yaw control. So they were the first to understand you need three-axis control, pitch, roll, and yaw. And they were the first to understand it. And also Greg mentioned the propeller, which was very important because they understood a propeller is a rotating wing. So they get a propeller shape of a wing, which is also very important. So I think those two were the most important inventions they made.
So just for fun, let me ask a moderator question here, Magnar. So we all agree the Wright Flyer 3 was the first practical plane. In your opinion, with your definition, what would you say the first airplane was, even if it wasn't practical?
The first airplane, yeah, with the flyer number one, the first flyer barely made it. But as Greg said, you have to take baby steps. So where do we put the definition? Number two managed to fly for several minutes. It managed to fly a circle, but it was also very difficult to fly. So where do we put the border? It's a difficult one. I think we should stay with the first one.
I don't really have a great answer to that either. You know, it's because it's a process that ends in a very successful product, which is Wright Flyer 3. So it's hard to really peg a point at which the airplane is invented, because it was a number of it was a many year long scientific experiment that the Wrights were doing, and there are a lot of points that were extremely important. You know, I think that third Wright glider is actually more important than the 1903 Wright Flyer 1. The first glider proved that everything they were doing was working: three-axis controls, wing design, their understanding of center of gravity, all of that stuff. Wright Flyer 1 was really just that with an engine put on it. And, you know, there was some science in that they made their own engine with the help of somebody named Charlie Taylor, who was a big deal. And that's impressive. You know, they cast an aluminum block, something that was relatively unheard of at the time. They figured out the props, as Magnar mentioned. They figured out a prop as a rotating wing, and also more. And Magnar knows this, but I want to state for clarity, that doesn't just mean it's a wing out there on a propeller. The wing has to have a lot of twist in it as a propeller. It's got to have a much steeper angle of attack to get an equal amount of thrust near the hub as compared to out of the tip. They figured that out. It's hard to really pinpoint a spot in the Wright's history. You go, okay, that's it. That's where they invented the airplane. If I had to do it, I would probably say, I guess I'd have to go with the 1903 powered flyer, but a very strong argument can be made for the glider. But yeah, we certainly agree that it's somewhere in there, and I think we agree on that, and we certainly agree that the Wright Flyer 3 is the first practical airplane, which was in 1905. All of the people that flew after 1905, like, I guess we'll get to Santos Dumont, but Magnar mentioned Santos Dumont, and one thing that the Dumont fans never mention is that craft flew after the Wright's patent was public. The Wright patent was filed in 1903, but it wasn't public until 1906. That's why the Wrights were being so secretive. They didn't want their info getting out. That's a Santos Dumont. That's his 14 bis. And obviously it's being suspended by wires there. It's not actually flying in this picture. He did actually fly it, though. And This is a fairly early version. I'm not going to jump ahead on the Santos Dumont thing. I'll let I have a lot to say about that, but I guess we're finishing up the moderator question. I don't have a good answer to a point where I can say, yes, this is where the airplane was invented. I would, I think it's nebulous. It's somewhere between
Yeah.
the 1902 and 1903 airplane. But we certainly agree 1905 is the first practical airplane.
Yeah.
Very good. Very
But
good.
we can say, okay, the first flight that was powered was in 1903. So we can say, okay, that was the first airplane. And then we can say it took another 2 years before it became practical.
Yeah, and who invented that?
Yeah,
The Wright brothers.
yeah.
I mean, we're talking about putting an actual date on it, but I don't think that there's any dispute here at this point that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. At least I'm not hearing it from you. I mean, is that what are your thoughts?
Yeah, they invented it. That's no
All
doubt.
right. Okay. All
So
right.
we can discuss which model
Sure.
defined the airplane. And when you added an engine, absolute. And but the third glider was important for the control.
Yeah.
They learn about the control, and then they put on engine. Then it become an airplane.
Yeah, I agree with
So
all
in
that.
that respect, we can say 1903 was the first flight of an airplane.
I want to add, Magnar,
Okay.
you disagree explicitly with Greg on that these forerunners to the Wright brothers, like Otto Lilienthal. It was more than just, didn't you claim it was more than just inspiration, but the Wright brothers used components from these from those who went before them? Maybe you take the side they stood on the shoulders of the giants, whereas Greg ascribes all the Wright brothers' success to their own research and scientific method. Is that fair, where you two might disagree?
Yeah, we can say we disagree a little bit, but I also agree with Greg that Lilienthal made mistakes in his calculations. But if you go back as Canute, he described his wing, the biplane with the struts, the wires. As an engineer, he thought that out and it was adapted. And we also have earlier people who described cambered wing was necessary for lift. So yeah, they took some of those ideas, put together, and then they developed a lot themselves, which I think the rudder, the yaw control, and the propeller were the most important parts they invented.
Greg?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm most of that. I mean, to the extent I disagree, it's in the gray areas or the margins. You know, I've conceded that I do think that the Wrights very likely got the idea of the basic structure of their early airplanes from Chanute. You know, that resemblance is unmistakable. If you look at Chanute's glider, it does look a lot like a Wright glider in the basics, in the structure, the shape of the wing. But Chanute was nowhere near having an actual wing that worked. The Wrights figured that out. Chanute didn't even know how to figure out how to measure lift, or he didn't have any idea how to start making a wing that would work. He just made something that looked about right, and I think he certainly contributed the structure. But he never had controls. He never had a power plant. He never had a successful flight in any of these things. And believe me, people tried. A lot of people built Chanute gliders. So, you know, the value of his contribution there, it's really hard to put anything on. I think the Wrights probably would have come up with something similar anyway. As for the curvature of the wing, Magnar brought that up. That's an interesting discussion. There was real division in the aviation community, such as it was, about whether a wing needed to be flat or if a wing needed to be curved. And flat wings and curved wings behave very differently. And of course, the ultimate solution was we now know wings have to have curvature to be really effective. Not to say you can't make a flat wing work, but it's difficult. Um, I don't remember if Chanute is one that was one of the. He was probably in the curved wing camp, but a lot of people weren't. The guy that really drove home the curved wing thing was a guy named Augustus Herring. May come up later in the discussion. But the Wrights arrived at the idea that a wing had to have camber based on their own research. They had looked at what other people did, and they ended up having to throw everything out. They came up with the amount of camber they had based on their own research. And actually, that's an interesting point. I think we talked about this in an earlier discussion we'd had, meaning the three of us. The Wrights, that's one of the things they kind of got wrong. The wing they designed worked, and it worked great, and it worked very well up until the Germans figured out a better way to make a wing right around 1917. But that shape of the wing the Wrights were using, really, which is a very thin, I don't think we have a picture of the profile of a Wright wing, but it's a very thin wing in profile. Okay. And that was used up through most of the World War I fighters, Sopwith Camel, Albatross, the Nieuports. It wasn't until, I think the guy's name was Gottingen, a German aerodynamicist, figured out that actually a fat wing is better, but the Wrights didn't get that right. So
I got a picture of it here, Greg.
Do you? Okay, great.
Here we go.
Yeah, very, very good. So all of these wings are very thin, and everybody went with that Wright airfoil, like I say, well into World War I. It did work, it did fly, but their conclusion, the Wright's conclusion that that was the optimal shape for a wing, actually turned out to be wrong. Modern wings, starting from about 1917, look a lot different. In fact, if you look at the Wright airfoil there and just envision filling it in from that dotted line, in other words, consider the dotted line, the lower part of the wing, that's kind of more the shape of wings from 1917 on. So that's something the Wrights, their research wasn't exactly right. They did the best with what they could, but it's not, I don't want to criticize them too much here. I mean, the wing worked, it flew, and that's what everybody went with, but it was not the end all be all of wing designs. I guess that's the way I'll say it.
Very good.
Yeah, the Wright brothers, they tested a lot of different wing profiles. I think 200. Is that correct?
That sounds right. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So they tried a lot of different shapes before they ended up with what they did. But of course, when you have a small model and you scale it up, it will behave differently. But they were not aware of that. Yeah.
Right.
Because you cannot scale up the air molecules, to say it simple.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But I don't think anybody knew that at the time of the Wrights. That was something that I believe was discovered in the 1920s. I'm not sure about that. I think that was a NACA thing, and I think that's why they built their whole pressurized wind tunnel, and it's a whole other story. But I don't think anybody at the time the Wright brothers were inventing the airplane, let's say 1900 to 1905 in that range, I don't think they knew that you couldn't just scale this stuff up. But they did at least verify this stuff with full-scale testing, as I described with the chains and the fish scales. So if they tested in the wind tunnel, it worked, and then they built a full-scale version and it had enough lift to work and do what they needed to do, they built it, and that did result in a successful airplane. And again, that wing design was the dominant wing design up until about 1917, which is a long time when you consider how fast aviation was growing once all of the Wright secrets were out, which was in really 1908.
Yeah.
Look at 1908 to 1918, it's like there's just massive improvements in airplanes.
I have a question here for Greg. Hypothetical history is always tough, but let's say the Wrights are completely taken out of the equation. How much would that delay the airplane from taking first flight?
A really long time. I would conservatively say 10 years. Most of the people that were in aviation, in fact, I think the Wrights actually had a quote like after some of their first early failures, which were more successful. Their failures were more successful than a lot of these other people that were aviation pioneers. And after their first failures, I believe the Wrights said something like, it's going to take 1,000 years to figure this out, or nobody's going to fly for 1,000 years. I don't think it would have been 1,000 years, but every other experiment that was going on was fatally flawed for a number of reasons. Very often wing design, but in every case, lack of control. Every other experiment that was going on was focused on stability, not control. The idea being that if we could just get it to be stable enough, we could point it in the right direction and it would go where we want and be stable and land. That is an absolute dead end, and that is the dead end that everybody was heading towards. So I think had the Wrights not been in, the airplane probably wouldn't have been invented for 10 years, which means that it would have missed World War I, which means all the development of military aviation that was figured out in World War I would have then had to happen in World War II, which would have drastically affected World War II, which would drastically affect world history. So, yeah, I think the Wrights, if they hadn't invented the airplane when they did, it would have really affected, the entire 20th century. the I can't really put a date on when somebody would have flown, but nobody was even starting to work on controllability to any reasonable amount. Nobody alive. And I want to stress how much this free flight thing is a dead end. If airplanes have a certain amount of inherent stability, and all pilots know that. But if you just let go of the controls of an airplane, it is not going to just fly itself to a safe landing. Not very often. It might, I mean, occasionally you might get lucky. But what will actually happen, and you can see this in free flight models, there are a big hobby of building models that fly freely and then they sort of land and you go recover your airplane, launch it again. And when I was a kid, I would build these free flight models. And I recently watched some YouTube videos on free flight models. I must have watched 50 or maybe 100 of these flights, and they almost always end in a crash. And by a crash, I mean they don't land at a landing speed and the landing attitude. They might, now they're built, the free flight models are typically built very lightly and they go very slow, and they're typically flying these models in an area with tall grass. So when they hit the ground, they're sort of cushioned by that, and they're usually flyable again. But they don't land in a landing attitude at a landing speed. They more often than not crash. And if you just let go of it at the controls of an airplane, what will usually happen is it'll fly at the speed at which it's trimmed for. So it'll oscillate in pitch a little bit to try and maintain that speed. As it slows down, the nose will drop, it'll speed back up, and then the nose will rise. And an uncontrolled airplane will generally modulate in pitch a bit and usually end up in a turn one direction or the other. And so it'll be a downward spiral with pitch going up and down. That's been true in my own experience. But you certainly remember working on your commercial license where you're out in the practice area and you've got to get your 250 hours of flying, and you've already done all the chandelles and lazy eights you can do, and you feel like you're ready for the check ride. So I'm sure you did stuff like this too. I would just let go of the controls and see what happens. And that indeed is what happens in a full-scale airplane, just like a free flight model. That is why all of these things were on a dead end path. Free flight is a dead end. You cannot put a human being into one of those things and rely on it to safely land itself without flight controls, let alone land where you want it to, one town over or whatever, at an airport. It's just not going to happen. So everybody was on a dead end path. That's all I got on that.
Yeah.
Awesome. I feel like we've gone. So we had a list of individuals to review. I know we didn't talk a ton about Langley. We did a little bit, but we went over everyone else. Would you two like to close or include any additional thoughts?
Oh, Langley, yes. So he built a model. It flew quite long, but in a straight line, more or less, and landed in water. He didn't even attempt to make it land properly. And when he built a full-scale airplane, it crashed at launch, and he did try it again, and again it crashed. But since Langley was secretary of the Smithsonian, and Smithsonian, they exhibited, they put the aircraft on display and said this was the first airplane. And it haven't even flown properly. And there was a big dispute with the Wright brothers, right? Because it took 45 years before the flyer came on display at Smithsonian. The Wright brothers, Orville Wright, he brought it to England. It was on display there. So I think you, Greg, you know more about this dispute.
Well, yeah, I have a lot to say about that. Langley did fly 2 flights with his glider called Aerodrome number 5, which was not the 5th one in the series. It was the 6th one. All the previous ones crashed. I would say Aerodrome number 5 crashed as well. That's when we call it a successful flight. Well, I don't know. My definition of a successful flight is probably not that much different from yours. I like to have a safe landing, taxi to the gate, and not have to call the chief pilot and explain what happened. That wasn't the case. These Aerodrome 5s flew around. They more or less flew in what I described. I believe the text from that event, there were witnesses. In fact, I think maybe Alexander Graham Bell was one of the witnesses. They flew in a circle with oscillating pitch and crashed into the lake. So, it's kind of a stretch to define that, I think, as a successful flight. It was a successful flight by a free-flying standards. And then they pulled the pieces out of the lake, reattached the wings. That's not the model, that's the manned airplane there. But they pulled the wreckage of the model out of the wings and flew it again, and it did basically the same thing. And based on that, they thought, oh, well, we'll scale this thing up and put a man in it, and we're good to go. So then Lilienthal built his man-carrying version of the aerodrome, which is what you just showed. And you can put that picture back on screen if you want, Andrew. And it launched from this houseboat on a catapult. The catapult alone was many times greater than the Wright brothers' entire budget for all the years they worked on this. And after launching from the catapult, it plunged directly into the ocean. It went about maybe one boat length from where it launched and plunged into the water. So they pulled it out and did what they did with the models. They pulled it out of the water, rebuilt it, and launched it again. And this time they put more power on the catapult. Samuel Langley thought, and this is going to sound crazy, but he thought that drag was greater at low speeds than at high speeds, which it is if you're at extremely low speeds. But once the plane is taken off, it's usually above that speed. But Langley's belief was that the drag would decrease with speed, which is completely wrong. And so he thought that the catapult launch was the only way to get one of these things past that high drag speed regime and into the air. So for the second launch, they cranked the catapult up a bit to launch a little bit harder. And if you can pull up the Langley picture I sent you, what did I name that? Langley Aerodrome, something like that. Anyway, I sent one picture of Langley's craft taken off. The second one. And the thing basically disintegrated on the catapult. There we go. Yeah, that's so you can see the houseboat launching platform on the right side there. And that structure that's separating from the airframe is one of the two wings. So again, this steam-powered craft fell apart on launching and fell into the ocean. Now, that ended the experiment. I think Langley knew that this craft was a dead end, but Langley passed away shortly after, and another man took over in the Smithsonian. What was his name? I think I don't know I don't remember the name of the guy that took over, but the guy that took over from Langley had a real interest in sort of repairing the reputation of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian was more than just a museum. The Smithsonian was taking a lot of government funding to try and invent the airplane. And after Langley failed, and worse, the Wrights succeeded with no government money. This is two guys that own a bicycle business, and the bicycle business in Ohio is seasonal. And in the off season, they're spending all their own money and spending 2 years away from their family or 3 years away, living in a three-sided barn for the most part, in the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, trying to invent the airplane. And those guys beat the official U.S. government effort. This was very embarrassing to the Smithsonian. So they were upset about this. And so around 1914, and the whole patent dispute thing was going on with Glenn Curtiss. In the meantime, let's say 1906 to 1914, something like that. Well, Glenn Curtiss lost that patent dispute and lost it very, very badly. This, I know it's a long story, but this all ties into the Smithsonian. It's important. When Glenn Curtiss lost the patent suit against the Wrights, the judge it would have been a big benefit to the government for the Wrights patent to not hold up, but it was so strongly written that it did hold up. The judge ruled not only that Curtiss and everybody else that was flying was in violation of the Wrights patent, but he ruled that the Wrights patent was a pioneer patent. That's a legal term. I'm not a lawyer, but the general gist of it is a pioneer patent is a patent on something that is entirely new, a new field of science, a new field of mechanics, whatever it is. It's not simply an improvement on something else. And because they granted the Wrights patent a status as a pioneer patent, that absolutely ended all the lawsuits that they were involved in. It was just over. But the Smithsonian, their reputation was tarnished. And they knew that the government was going to start spending a lot of money on aircraft research, and they wanted that government money. They're a government agency. That's what government agencies want. And the head of the Smithsonian, I wish I could remember his name. I think it's Wilcox. Anyway, whatever, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, Charles Doolittle Walcott is what I pulled up here.
That sounds right, Walcott. Thank you. So Walcott wanted to resurrect Langley's aircraft laboratory in an effort to get government funding to come in and be sort of a technical hub and center of aircraft design. So the way he went about this, because the failure of Langley was such a big blight on their record, the way he went about this is he got together with Glenn Curtis and said, look, we're going to send you the wreckage of that craft that crashed into the Potomac, the one we showed a picture of a minute ago. They sent that to Glenn Curtis. He rebuilt it, and he rebuilt it with modern stuff. He reshaped the propellers, he changed the shape of the wings, put in a control system, reinforced the structure, put pontoons on it so it could, go along in the river, didn't need to be launched from a catapult. He modified the engines to get more power, and with all of these modifications, that thing, quote unquote, flew. What it actually did is travel at high speed down the river, or high enough speed to sort of hop into the air, never more than a few feet off the ground. I think it got as high as 6 feet, and then would touch down, and then build up speed, and then get up in the air a few feet. And it basically went no more than 5-6 feet off the ground. And this was in 1914. Okay, keep in mind, 1914 airplanes are an absolute thing. And based on this, the Smithsonian then said, okay, Langley's aircraft was actually the first heavier than air man-powered aircraft that was capable of flight. It only failed because of the catapult system. But the fact that it was a very heavily modified deal came out. And instead of just admitting it, they did admit it later, but the Smithsonian sort of doubled down because they really wanted all that government money they thought that was going to be coming in. And Congress did create that agency, but the Smithsonian didn't get that job. That was the agency that became NACA, the National Advisory Council on Aeronautics. I just made a whole video about that agency. So the Smithsonian was trying to become what actually became NACA, which is what is today NASA. So the Smithsonian was trying to get all that government money and be what today we would think of as NASA. And this was their ploy to get it. And of course, this upset the Wright brothers because this was, completely wrong. That what they flew had no, first of all, it didn't really fly. And second of all, it had no real bearing on what Langley attempted to fly in 1903. And they, of course, were especially upset at Glenn Curtis for participating in this. So even after the patent suit was over, the Wright still wouldn't grant Glenn Curtis the right to build airplanes. The right to build airplanes is maybe the wrong word. The way that patent suit worked when it ended was that anybody could build airplanes, but they had to pay the Wrights some sort of royalty. And I don't remember what it was. It was some percentage, though. But they wouldn't even authorize Glenn Curtis to do it. They'd authorize anybody else to do it. But they really, really disliked Glenn Curtis because of the patent lawsuits. And then after they won the lawsuit, then Glenn Curtis tries to do this end run around him with Langley. So Langley, my thoughts on him are he's a legit scientist. He was really trying, did not invent anything that was remotely related to the invention of the aircraft. But after Langley's death, the people running the Smithsonian sort of tried to resurrect his legacy and claim that he did invent the airplane and take credit away from the Wrights. And the Wrights were upset about that. So eventually, what they did is they wouldn't allow the Wright Flyer to be displayed in the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian was getting so many letters, people complaining, hey, why aren't you displaying a Wright Flyer, that the Smithsonian had to create a form letter they sent out to people. Look, just fill out the form and send it to us. We know what you're complaining about. They eventually did get the Wright Flyer back, and they did this by entering, and this is important because people cite this agreement as evidence that the Wrights didn't invent the airplane, and it's absolutely false. The story that you'll hear out there is that the only reason the Smithsonian says that the Wrights invented the airplane is because they're contractually not allowed to say otherwise. And that's not true. What the people that say that haven't read the contract. What the contract says is that if the Smithsonian says that somebody else was first in flight, then the Wrights get to take back, or their heirs, I guess at this point, get to take back their airplane, and the Smithsonian can't display it anymore. That's what it says. So if the Smithsonian determined for sure that George Whitehead or whoever flew the airplane first, they could absolutely say that, display that, and it might even be in their interest financially to do that. That might increase people going to the museum, to learn the new truth, so to speak. But they don't do that because it's not true. But there's nothing in that contract that prevents the Smithsonian from saying somebody else flew first. It's just that if they do, they lose the Wright Flyer.
Now you mentioned Whitehead, and that's a story that fooled me. because I found the story online, and Wikipedia has a very interesting article and say, oh, it's proved so and so and so. And I was thinking, why isn't it known better? But you found the reason for the story, and that's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a bunch of nonsense. Whitehead never really flew. There are claims that Whitehead flew. The earliest one is that he flew in Pittsburgh, and it's actually almost comical to think about it. I'm going to describe what Whitehead described that he did. So he flew a craft that was steam engine powered, two people in it. He was flying it, steering it by shifting his weight around, I suppose. He doesn't really say that. And the other crew member was stowing the fire because it was a steam engine, and somebody's got to shovel coal in or wood or whatever you're putting in to keep the head of steam up to keep this thing going. And he said this thing flew for some distance along the streets of Pittsburgh and crashed into a building. The story is just not believable. And for one thing, it's almost comical just to picture that. You know, two guys in a boat with wings on it, one of them shoveling coal or whatever it is to keep the fire stoked. It's comical to think about, except that if they did do that and crashed into a building at a speed high enough to sustain flight, they almost certainly would have died. That I don't believe that flight ever happened. The second one that comes up a lot is in a article in a newspaper called the Bridgeport Herald, and if you look at any newspapers from any American city from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and read through those newspapers, you will find articles talking about some so and so who supposedly flew. You know, he jumped off a barn and went 100 yards or something. Those articles were very, very common, and I think it's necessary to sort of describe the way newspapers work. So the myth of his second flight is contained in a newspaper in the Bridgeport Herald, and it's not on the front page, and I think that kind of matters. It's on page 5. So I have some of those papers up here. Let me see if I can pull it up. Well, of course, I don't have it, but the gist of it is, it's on page 5 of the Bridgeport Herald. Page 1 of the Bridgeport Herald that day that Whitehead supposedly flew had what you would call normal news. When there were newspapers, the big news was always on page 1. Those are your headlines, page 1. Page 1 that day was a trolley car accident, a labor movement union issue with the local mill or whatever it was, and news like that, actual news, but nothing super exciting, nothing like inventing the airplane. Page 2 had sports news, which was a big deal back then. Page 3 had generally gossip, like the lighter news, the lighter stuff that's going around, you know, not like a trolley car accident or labor union, but small potato stuff. So and so opened up a bakery on B Street or whatever. Page 4 was letters to the editor. And on page 5 of the newspaper, they had just whatever crazy story they felt like printing. That's page 5 of the Bridgeport Herald. And that was kind of the standard newspaper format of the time. So on page 5 of the Bridgeport Herald, that's where the story of this supposed second flight that Whitehead had, which is completely nonsensical. It's completely not believable. But because it was in the newspaper, people talk about it. And they neglect to mention that it was on page 5. A typical story, a story that was shown very shortly after that, I sent Andrew a screenshot of a page 5 story from the same Bridgeport Herald newspaper, and
Pull it up here.
Pull it up to remind you. Got it up. It's hard to read on my screen here, but it's like the Wolf Boy. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Got it. Dog Man.
What's the title of it?
Let's see. I got it right here.
Okay.
Let me pull it up. Hold on one sec. Yeah, it's titled Dog
Man.
That's why it was hard.
Yeah, it's the Dogman of Wyndam, and it describes this basically Bigfoot-like character with the head of a dog, and it shows a drawing of him, and it shows a drawing of the three-sided hut he supposedly lives in the jungle, and talks about people who have seen the Dogman of Wyndam. This is the type of story that would be on page 5. This is where this story about Cahill was printed. It's not serious news. It's not something that anybody really witnessed or saw. And then this is the story that gets picked because people like reading it. It's an enjoyable thing. This is the story that gets picked up and put into what we would now call syndication. And when you hear about Whitehead's flights being reported in 80 newspapers around the country, that doesn't mean that some journalist went there and documented things and took pictures or did anything. It just means that there was a letter to the, a tall tale, so to speak, in the Bridgeport Herald that then got caught up in syndication because it sounded good. There's no evidence that that flight actually took place. And in fact, when you read through the claims, it sounds ridiculous. It's another one where he, left at night and then flew at dawn. And it reads like an H.G. Wells novel, the way he talks about it. I don't believe that it ever happened. And there's no evidence that it happened. His third flight that people talk about is even more ridiculous. That one's in, I think it was American Inventor magazine. And I think I have something I wrote down on this. Yeah, I'm going to just read this. So Gustav Whitehead, he never flew any powered airplane, and I stand on that statement. Now, the main source for the myth of Whitehead stems from the story published in the April 1st, that's April Fool's Day, 1902 edition of American Inventor. So this is after the one that I just mentioned in the Bridgeport Herald. I'd like to point out some factors and claims from the article. Now, it's very important to note this is not a news story. It's a letter to the editor written by Whitehead himself, not something witnessed by a journalist. And Andrew can pull up pictures of this article. I believe that Magnar sent him in. So first of all, it's written by Whitehead himself. It's dated for April Fool's Day. He claims that the engine powering this thing is his own design. It's a 40 horsepower engine and weighs 120 pounds. That would be so far ahead of any other engine of its time that engine was in the realm of science fiction. If that had existed in 1902, it would have been as big a deal as the aircraft itself. Now, the first claimed flight Whitehead flew on this day was 2 miles in length. The second one was 7 miles and had two 360-degree turns before landing, something the Wrights couldn't do until 1904. And even in France, they couldn't do that until probably 1909. Now, after this supposed 7-mile-long flight, the craft never flew again. That's a very important point. Not only that, Whitehead changed his design completely after this. Now, why would he do that if the thing actually flew? Whitehead claimed the craft reached 70 miles an hour with a top speed of 100 miles per hour. That's the performance of an early World War I airplane. Whitehead claimed both flights ended in successful water landing, so successful the plane was undamaged and could fly away right after that. That's another big claim, a successful water landing in an early flight. So the whole story is nonsense. If you compare and contrast it with any other known powered first flight, it's an obvious fabrication. But Whitehead didn't know what a first powered flight was going to look like, so he couldn't properly think through his bullshit here. If we look at the early pioneers who actually did get powered aircraft off the ground, people like the Wright brothers in 1903, a few years later in France, you had Blériot, Dumont, Viocin, and I apologize for French pronunciations, doing the best I can here, and there were some others. They all had first flights that basically went straight ahead and for a short distance, usually a few dozen meters at best, very often ending in crashes. And this makes sense, as even if you had a perfectly functional airplane, there's a human element at play here. Flying an element is a learned physical skill. I used a baby analogy earlier. I'll do it again. It's like a baby learning to walk. A baby's first steps are usually 2 or 3 steps from the edge of a table to a couch, where they usually fall over. However, we're expected to believe that Whitehead's baby ran 50 meters for a touchdown and then spiked the ball without water landing on his first attempt at walking. As crazy as that story is, the real nail in the coffin, though, is that the craft never flew again. It was basically never seen again. Reporters would go to look at it and it was nowhere to be found. Now, once the investor money started flowing in, Whitehead, which it did as a result of this article, which was, again, a letter to the editor on April Fool's Day. But once the money started flowing in, Whitehead abandoned this design. A design, again, he claimed flew 70 miles an hour and could make 360-degree turns and land on water. And what did he focus on building at that point when money was coming in and he had to deliver something? He essentially built Octave Chanute design gliders. Of course, these didn't really fly either, but they could at least manage a very short, steep, and uncontrolled glide. Now, I ask, if you really believe the Whitehead story, then why did he switch to that design? Why did he switch from something that was so well proven to something that he knew had never flown? I suggest it's because he needed to design something. He needed a design that could at least show some progress. His number 22 aircraft that he based all this on never actually left the ground, but the Chanute gliders at least had a chance. Now, the other article I mentioned, the Bridgeport Herald one I mentioned a minute ago, that talks about a 30-minute manned controllable flight. Again, it's a page 5 story, which people miss. Now, one of the things that comes up in the Whitehead thing is the eyewitnesses. So about that, there are 18 of them, and every one of those eyewitness stories, everyone has huge holes in it. And I want to point out that 18 is not very many considering Whitehead's huge claims. There are more eyewitnesses to Bigfoot every month than we have for Whitehead's all of his flights over his entire aviation career, his supposed flights. I maintain that he never flew. I'm not going to go into all of these. I can literally shoot down every single one of them. One of them, the so-called witnesses, is the person that wrote the article in the Bridgeport Herald, or at least the person that we think wrote the article for the Bridgeport Herald. Other affidavits, when you look at them, and you look at them with a critical eye, you find that they don't say, "Oh, I saw Whitehead fly." One of them says, "I heard he flew, go talk to so-and-so. He can give you more information." That's how a lot of these affidavits are. One of the affidavits is from a woman who I estimate had to be over 100 years old because she was remembering something from 74 years earlier. I suspect that she's being truthful. I think that she saw something involved with Whitehead leaving the ground. I think it was probably one of the Chinook gliders being towed behind a car. That was one of the ways Whitehead would get things into the air, is tow them. In fact, his final aircraft, which he built in 1908, and I want to stress, he started taking all this money and never delivered a single aircraft that could even get off the ground until the very end. In 1908, a guy named Beach, he was big investing in with Whitehead, big in early aviation. This is not to be confused with the Beach of Beechcraft aircraft, totally different guy. But this guy Beach commissioned Whitehead to build an airplane in 1908, and it just looks like this ridiculous abomination. But he did get that airborne by towing it at fairly high speed with a car. So again, that's more of a kite than an airplane. And that is the only actual flight that I think we can prove that Whitehead had. His early flights are fanciful nonsense. If they had happened, we would be hearing about Whitehead aircraft being built today because he certainly had the investors in it. If that had happened, if he had that engine, we would have heard about that. That would have been a revolutionary engine. The engine he claims to invent was superior in statistics than a modern Rotax people were flying around in ultralights in terms of weight, power, reliability, and so forth. I think he also claimed the engine ran on acetylene, which is pretty fanciful on its own. Whitehead never flew. There's no evidence that he did. His stories are obvious concoctions, and I could talk all day and knock down every single so-called eyewitness that he has, but none of them. I'm not going to take up the time to do that and go through 18 of them.
Well, question about this. So you get
Uh-huh.
hundreds, if not thousands, of comments across your Patreon and YouTube and
Sure.
everything. What are some of the most common misconceptions that you may have not touched on about the Wrights that you see from your comments?
There are a lot. One, that the Wrights required a catapult to fly. It's absolute nonsense. The 1903 Flyer did not have a catapult. They flew the 1904. They flew Wright Flyer 2 and Wright Flyer 3 without catapults in some situations. But they did, starting from late 1904 on, use the catapult a lot, which makes a lot of sense. What else were they going to use? It's taken off out of Kitty Hawk. Those are sand dunes. You're not going to use wheels there. And then when they went up to Ohio, they were flying off of Huffman Prairie, and the prairies in Ohio are extremely rough. There's a name for the type of surface, and I don't remember what it is, but it consists of like 6-foot high little mini mounds all over the place. You can't roll something down it, so they couldn't use wheels. They certainly weren't going to build a runway. For one thing, you want to take off into the wind, they'd have to build a bunch of different runways. That would be very expensive. They went with what was the most economical and simple solution, which is we get a derelict windmill that nobody's using, use that as a tower, haul weights up to the top of it, have a pulley system and essentially a long 2x4 to use as a launching rail, might have been a 2x8 or whatever it was. And we manually get the weights raised, whether human power, horse, whatever, and hook the launching mechanism onto the craft, point it into the wind, which is easy to do because the launching rail is not that long, drop the weights, and it takes off. The catapult did not by itself get the craft up to flying speed. It'd be better if it did, but it was a simple device that was easy to take down, transport, and that enabled them to fly anywhere. There were no airports at the time. Obviously, there were barely any airplanes at the time. So other than using a portable catapult, I really can't think how they could have demonstrated their airplane wherever they wanted to. They could take this setup with their airplane and go demonstrated anywhere. And then they had skids so they could land on virtually any surface. But they could take off on the skids too. And they demonstrated that in France. When they first went to France, this was in 1908, and they demonstrated their airplane there. And they won all sorts of awards. They won the Michelin Cup for distance, and they just shattered the record. I don't remember what the times were, but the previous record was like 30 seconds, and they flew for an hour or whatever it was. It was some huge number. And they won that award, and they also won an award for altitude. Everybody else had been making very short little hops, and the Wrights were never really focused on altitude. They would just go up and fly around. But in this case, I think they went up to nominally 1,000 feet, like 300 meters, or might have been 200 meters, whatever it was. They went up high enough to set the altitude record. And when they got back down, one of the people from whatever the name of the organization was that managed records, aviation records, which was started by the Aero Club of France.
FAI.
Is that it?
Yeah,
FAI.
they still do
Yeah.
too. Amazingly.
Yeah, there you go.
Federation Aeronautique Internationale.
Exactly. Well, the conception of that organization is after the Wrights first flew. So of course they didn't, document any of the Wrights' early flights, but they documented this altitude record. And when the Wrights came back down and landed, they said, well, no, it doesn't count. Used a catapult to take off. So then Wilbur Wright said, basically said, oh yeah, watch this. And he took off on the skids without the catapult, and then redid the record, and then of course won that record. And he won many other awards at the same time. So, but one misconception is that the Wright flyer required a catapult to fly. Even if it did require a catapult to take off, which it did not, that still to me would not negate the fact that it's a flyable airplane, unless it's only flying to the extent that the catapult launches it. If the catapult launches at 50 feet, but then it takes off and flies for an hour, well, that's clearly beyond what the energy the catapult was giving it. So the catapult's got nothing to do with it. One of the other misconceptions, that's probably the biggest misconception, that the Wrights required a catapult, and when they didn't even use a catapult on their first flight. Another misconception is that this is a common argument people bring up. They say, well, no replica of the Wright flyer has ever flown, and there's a Santos Dumont replica, and it flies just fine. And there's even a YouTube video where they have one after the other. That is a ridiculous argument, and it falls apart as soon as you start looking into it. But if you just watch a quick YouTube video, I get it. It sounds good. First of all, they're making a replica of Wright Flyer 1, which, I think I've conceded only flies with a very low density altitude. So you've got to have really ideal conditions to get that thing off the ground. You also have to have a pilot that's familiar with it. Remember, if Magnar and I get into a Wright Flyer, the controls are all wrong. We don't have any muscle memory, or you, Andrew, have any muscle memory that's going to enable us to fly that thing. It doesn't have a rudder and joystick and normal throttle. That wouldn't come along until 1909. I believe Blériot figured that out. So when the Wrights, I forgot where I was going with that. Anyway, he was talking about Dumont. I don't know. I've totally lost my train of thought.
The replica. Yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you. The Dumont replica. Okay. So when the Wright glider, when the person flying the Wright flyer has to fly, they're not going to have the physical skill needed to do it. Probably not. They're not going to have the density altitude needed to do it. And yet, even with that, we do have two successful flights of very authentic, two separate ones, Wright 1903 flyers. One was flown by John Denver. I say successful. I think he had one successful flight, and then it cracked up on the second one because, again, it was barely flying. And then there was one that was created for the 100th anniversary, and they tried to fly it in 2003. And on the date that it was supposed to fly, it couldn't get off the launching rail because the density altitude wasn't sufficient. They did fly it a few days later when it was a little bit colder, and it went 100 feet and plopped back down into the mud. But they did fly to the extent that they were able to, under their own power, lift off and travel. And there are countless records of later Wright aircraft flying perfectly well. So that's one thing. Now, the Dumont replica, here's the thing that people ignore. There's no surviving 14 bis. That's the 1906 Dumont airplane. That airplane doesn't exist. And there are no accurate drawings of it, and there are very few photographs of it. So if you're going to build a replica of that airplane, you have to take a certain amount of artistic license with how you think things were. And when you're designing it for the purpose of flying and showing that Dumont flew, you're probably going to hedge everything a little bit on the side of safety and on the side of flying. They're not true replicas of Dumont's craft. They're lookalikes. They also use modern engines, modern propellers, and still don't do anything other than go forward and sort of stay under control and land straight ahead. I realize that the Brazilians think that Dumont invented the airplane, and they base a lot of this on saying the 1903 Wright Flyer couldn't really fly, based on the replicas don't fly, and Dumont did. The Dumont thing is not a replica at all. It's a look-alike. It's got very little to do with the original airplane, other than some appearance. Again, different engine, different props, and and not the same airframe. And the Wright Flyers absolutely did fly, just not very well, which is exactly what you would expect. So those are, I guess, the two biggest things that we hear from the Dumont camp. The other thing that comes up all the time is Whitehead. People read the story, and it's a great sounding story. This German immigrant comes over. First of all, people argue that he's German. He actually, Gus Whitehead was an American at the time. He was a U.S. citizen at the time. He was working on all this aircraft. But people claim that there's some sort of nationalistic conspiracy keeping the myth of Whitehead down because he's German. It's a bunch of nonsense. He was American as anybody else at the time he was trying to fly. That's a picture of his craft. You can see the propellers don't look anything like a modern propeller. The thing he's holding is a steam engine. I don't know that that's the steam engine that he was trying to fly with, but it must be at least similar. Otherwise, he wouldn't be holding it. But you won't find a picture of this craft in the air. There's plenty of pictures of this craft on the ground. And this is kind of a combination of the boat people, bird people. It's the boat people hull, let's call it, and then a wing that kind of looks like a bird. And he's going to try and control this by shifting his weight around. Unlike Lilienthal, he doesn't even have a real way of, unless he's running around in the boat hull, he doesn't even have a real effective way of shifting his weight around. This is I believe this is his Model 22, could be his Model 21. In any case, this is the thing that he claims flies great. Took off, flew around for a long time, and then for some reason was completely abandoned, never seen again, and he switched over to the Octave Chanute gliders. I think that he just got caught up in his own tall tale. He tried to fly, wrote some tall tales about it because it was fun, and sort of protected himself by doing it on April Fool's Day. So if the whole thing went pear-shaped, he could say, "Hey, I was only kidding." But then money started flowing in, and he had to do something, and he, tried to keep it going, but of course it just fell on his face. That's all I have to say about Whitehead. I can't think of any other misconceptions that repeatedly come up, but those do. The idea that a Dumont replica has flown, not true. A Dumont lookalike has flown. That the Wrights never flew, not true. Accurate replicas have flown twice, not very well, but it's exactly what you would expect. It's exactly in line with the Wrights said. And
yeah, but anyway,
yeah,
the Flyer 3 flew in 1905. That's 1 year before Dumont. That's an argument. Yeah.
Well, one of the things they'll say is, well, they didn't fly publicly, but that's not true. They did fly publicly both in 1904 and 1905. But that's one of the things they say. And they also just sort of get upset that they get actually emotional about this. You can read it in the comments. They get upset that, like it's almost like they think Dumont deserves the credit because he was such a great guy. And as far as I can tell, he was a great guy. He's a really interesting guy. I mean, this guy had his own dirigible. I've commented before. He would dock this dirigible at his Paris apartment. Something I'm thinking the French wouldn't be too fond of if he tried to do something like that today. But regulations have changed. He would dock this dirigible at his Paris apartment for the purpose of taking women out on dates, which I thought was great. He would fly his dirigible if he'd hear about a child having a birthday party in the park. He would fly his dirigible and land and attend the kid's birthday party. I mean, just what a great guy. And Dumont, one of the things that drives me crazy about the claim that he invented the airplane is it takes away from all this amazing stuff he did. Dirigibles were powered by internal combustion engines when Dumont came along, and these engines were blowing up and sending hot shrapnel into the dirigible and lighting them on fire, and they weren't flying, they were crashing and people were dying. Dumont is really the guy that figured out how to make an engine powerful enough to run in a dirigible and not blow up and kill everybody. He really did move along the science of aircraft engines, and that was extremely important. And that actually put France, well, that and the fact that the French didn't have control of their early aircraft attempts, so they went with a lot of horsepower. And that's the reason the French were truly ahead of the rest of the world in aircraft engines in the late 1900s. Once they learned how to fly from the Wrights, once the Wrights demonstrated and showed them essentially everything in 1908, the French took the lead in aviation, so much so that almost every country flew French fighter planes in World War I. The Italians, the French, the British, the Americans, even the Germans built Newport 17s, not under license. They were on the other team, but they did build them.
And the
And
rotary
many,
engine, that's a French design. Like the Oberursel was just a copy.
exactly, that's a Laron basically. Everybody was using French designed engines. I mean, the French got a big head start in aviation. A lot of that is due to Santos Dumont. And that gets overlooked because of this false claim that he invented the airplane. That kind of annoys me. Santos Dumont, I think, was a great guy, and he did a lot of great things. But um, yeah, that's one of his. I don't know that that's a dirigible. A dirigible would have an internal frame. That might just be a gas balloon. But he had a lot of success with these things, and his success with the dirigibles really, yeah, that is a Santos. That's his number 9. It says right on it. Um, that really paved the way for good fixed wing aircraft engines. So, yeah, like Dumont, I'm a big fan. I'm just not a big fan of him being falsely credited for inventing the airplane. He didn't. His first flight, so-called flight, anyway, in 1906, it's a flight. That was after the Wright patent was completely public. He knew what was going on. You can even see the change in his 14 bits. You see the early ones don't have any form of roll control. The later ones, the ones that flew successfully, or more successfully, I should say, he set the records in, had interplane struts, or not interplane struts. I'd call them interplane panels. You might call them ailerons, but he had interplane panels in the outer portion of the wings. The wings were constructed of Hargrave cells. An Australian fellow named Lawrence Hargrave basically invented the box kite, which was a kite that was very stable, and thus it could lift a lot of weight. And Lawrence Hargrave would lift himself, so he created a man-lifting kite. And what Dumont did is he took these Hargrave cells, and just one of the nice things about box kites is you can put more of them together to get more lifting power. That was the idea of the Hargrave cell. Dumont put a bunch of Hargrave cells to make wings together to make wings, which worked. He put a Hargrave cell at the front, which pivots on a gimbal. That forward box structure, which is a Hargrave cell, is on a gimbal. Santos Dumont could move that around. In this drawing, he has no roll control, but this at least gave him a little bit of pitch and yaw, not very much. Santos Dumont, what he did have, and you can see it in this picture behind him, was a very powerful engine. And again, that is one of Dumont's big contributors. This aircraft is not. This aircraft is a total dead end. Dumont knew that. He abandoned this design after he saw the Wrights fly and sort of went in a completely different direction. And in 1909, came up with actually a pretty decent airplane. So that's my thought on Dumont. Great guy. Would have loved to have known him. It sounds like he's just, a really cool individual. But also, another thing to point out is that Dumont's a really wealthy guy. So when the Brazilians point out, oh, he was being generous and he was just creating aviation for, the whole world to share. Well, yeah, he could do that. He was a silver spooner. He was born wealthy. He never really had to work. This was kind of his hobby. It's always funny to me when wealthy people, whether they were born into it or become wealthy through hard work, suddenly turn into a Marxist all of a sudden. And that's a good example here is Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell, I'm sure most of you know this, but he invented the telephone. He invented the phonograph, that means the record player. Hey, it was a big deal when Magnar and I were kids. He invented ways of recording audio. Alexander Graham Bell invented all kinds of stuff, and he had all kinds of patents on all kinds of stuff. And he very aggressively defended those patents. But as soon as but he wanted to build airplanes, and he was a failed early aircraft pioneer. He built an airplane with this tetrahedron type wing. It's comical. It had no chance of flying. But when the Wright brothers invented the airplane, all of a sudden, Alexander Graham Bell, who's been this hardcore capitalist with all his patents, all of a sudden he's a Marxist. He's like, hey, bros, we're glad you invented that. You need to share that. That needs to be for the public because I want to build airplanes too, and I don't want to have to pay you any royalties out of, my pile of gold I'm sitting on like smog. That's always kind of bothered me. And Octave Chanute was a bit that way too. He's an older guy with a ton of money and saying, hey, you guys, you should just be giving away your work for free. That's one thing to say, but it's very hypocritical for somebody like, especially Alexander Graham Bell to say that, when he's been sitting on these patents, profiting and suing anybody that had patent infringement, and then saying that the Wrights need to just give everything away. Forget about the fact that you were risking life and limb and figured out what nobody in human history was able to do before, and living in a 3-sided barn for years away from your family and all that. That sort of irks me. And I'm not saying Dumont falls into that category. I just think it's a little bit arrogant for Dumont to act like the Wrights or the Dumont supporters. I'm not sure arrogant. I'm not sure that Dumont actually was saying the Wrights should give this away, but the Dumont supporters often point out that Dumont was willing to give everything away, which is true, but they really condemn the Wrights for not being willing to give everything away. And I don't think that's reasonable. I think the Wrights deserved the patent that they applied for and were awarded.
Question on this. Do you think
Yeah.
the Wrights took their designs as far as they could go? And I say this because they liked wing warping and were skeptical of ailerons.
Well, ailerons are very specifically covered in their patent. The word aileron is not in there, but they are very specifically covered in their patent. Now,
Okay.
they did not, and they also explain in their patent exactly why in their aircraft up to that time they went with wing warping as opposed to a movable surface. And the reason was with wing warping, you get a much more gradual change in angle of attack on the wing as you warp the whole wing down as opposed to deflecting a relatively small panel down. That panel's got to go down pretty far in comparative terms to get the rolling that you want. So that was their reasoning for not going with ailerons initially. But their patent absolutely did cover ailerons. It covered the interplane panels. In fact, at the beginning of what I'll call the patent wars, the game that was being played there by Glenn Curtis, and this wasn't really Glenn Curtis's fault. I think he was kind of led astray by Augustus Herring and also by Alexander Graham Bell. Augustus Herring told Glenn Curtis that, oh, don't worry about the Wright brothers' patents. I have patents that predate them. He didn't. Augustus Herring was making that up. Alexander Graham Bell did have patents, but they were after and did not in any way, trump the Wrights. But Glenn Curtis bought into this and he started building airplanes. And I think he got kind of trapped where he had to fight these patent wars with the Wrights. And his first airplane, the Junebug, had sort of movable tips, triangular shaped tips out in the edge of the wing for roll control. And the Wrights immediately sued him based on that. So then Glenn Curtis switched to interplane panels, which means nothing on the wing moves, but there are separate panels in between the wings on the biplane, and those move. And he used that on what's often called the Golden Flyer. Some people call it the Golden Bug, which is another airplane. The reason for doing this is to try and dodge the Wrights patent. So when the Wrights sue them for the Junebug, he goes, aha, well, I've got this other one. So then the Wrights have to sue him again. And Glenn Curtis could do this. He could afford to stay in court forever. Yeah, so you can see the panels in between the wings that are outboard. Those are often called interplane panels. Some people might call them ailerons. He was using those for roll control specifically to try and dodge the Wrights patent, which of course didn't work. And that was one of it. And that's not the only way he tried to dodge it. And the reason Glenn Curtis could do this is because he wasn't funding the legal battle himself. Glenn Curtis's legal battle was being funded by Henry Ford. In fact, more than that, he had the Curtis legal team was Henry Ford's legal team being paid for by Henry Ford. So Curtis could maintain all of these lawsuits going on. And there were, I think, 9 or 10 of them, because every time he would just change it a little bit so the Wrights would have to sue him again. And of course, in 1914, I think it was 1914, it was right around there, the courts ruled just utterly in favor of the Wrights and gave them that pioneer patent, or awarded it the status of pioneer patent, and it was over. But I do think Glenn Curtis got a little bit trapped by Augustus Herring and Alexander Graham Bell. I think he got into this really believing that those were the guys with the legit patent claim. But then once he's already spooled up and he's into this and he's building an airplane and he's setting records, which he did. He was a successful guy. Also a brave guy, knew a lot about engines, had motorcycle speed records, all kinds of things. I think he was just in too deep and had to stick out the legal battle. And then he also had, it's easy to stick out a legal battle when you've got Henry Ford funding your side of the fight. That's my thought on that patent fight. I think the Wrights, they deserve the patent, and all of these people that came along, people with tons of money saying, no, you should just share that, just share it. It's interesting that they don't want to share the wealth. They're all for Marxism when it doesn't apply to them. They just want to apply it to the new up and comers, the young people like the Wrights in this case.
Magnar?
Yeah,
Any,
that sounds that's great, because not many knew about this conflict, and I absolutely agree that the Wright brothers deserve a patent because for all the work they did and inventions. So they really deserved it. And of course, aviation evolved. And from 1912, I would say it really took off.
Yeah.
And you saw a lot of designs around the world, especially France, but also Britain, Germany, and United States come after.
Yeah, the United States was delayed significantly because of those patent wars, and people blame the Wright brothers for that. I think that's unreasonable. I think that it's much more reasonable to blame the person that's trying to steal the patent. They could have been building airplanes all along, but no company is going to sign up and start paying the Wright brothers royalties when somebody's fighting them and you got with Henry Ford's legal team under the assumption that those patents are going to go away anyway. So why sign a contract with the Wrights? And the Wrights weren't demanding unreasonable fees either. Other people could have been building airplanes that would have been profitable. In fact, that's what happened after the Wrights won the patent. And Orville Wright got out of aviation. This is another argument. This is my argument that the Wrights had nothing to do with the delaying aviation, because that's the argument you hear. The Wright brothers were enforcing their patent, and that just ruined aviation. If that was true, then when the Wright brothers sold out, Wilbur had already passed away at this point, but Orville Wright, I believe, sold the company in 1914 or 1915. It was very shortly after he won the patent dispute, because then that meant his company was valuable, and he cashed out for the equivalent of several $1,000,000 in today's money. And yet these patent suits in the aviation industry continued going on, and if anything, they gained steam of one company suing another over aircraft patents. In fact, Glenn, these patent wars, I might argue, would actually kill Wilbur Wright. It created a lot of stress in his life because he was spending most of his time dealing with this. Again, it's a big deal when you're fighting a major company like Ford. And Wilbur Wright died, I think, because of that stress. But more so, Glenn Curtiss died because of this. I don't think there's any question about that. Glenn Curtiss literally keeled over in a courtroom, fighting one of his many patent fights. This particular one wasn't against the Wright brothers; it was against Augustus Herring, his business partner. And then Glenn Curtiss died very shortly after in the hospital. I mean, he effectively dropped dead in a courtroom. I mean, he literally fought in court to his death. Those patent wars were extremely unproductive, but they didn't start with the Wrights. They started with people infringing on the Wrights patent, and they didn't even end once the patent was established and once Orville Wright himself was out of it. They kept going on until 1917, when the United States was getting into World War I. The government came up with something they called a patent pool, and I forget the terminology that they used, but they basically said that the Wrights are going to get some cut for every airplane, or the Wright Corporation at that point. The Wright brothers were out of it. And you guys are going to start building airplanes, and NACA, the newly formed National Advisory Council on Aeronautics, is going to be the central warehouse for all of this information. And if you make an aircraft patent, you can profit from it, but ultimately it's going into the patent pool. And that was the solution for that. But the Wrights had nothing to do with those problems before that. They didn't have the power to create a patent pool or NACA or whatever. Again, it just irks me when people say that the Wrights should have just been willing to give all this away for free and let people just, steal their patent. No, nobody views it that way. Again, it's the Marxism for thee and not for me. Nobody does that with their own labor. I shouldn't say nobody, but for the most part, if somebody works hard for a period of years and invents something, they expect some compensation for that, and the Wrights were no different.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I've gone through all my mod questions that I have to both of you. We've been at it for a little touch over 2 hours. How about we end with some closing thoughts just from both parties?
Sure, Magnar, go ahead.
Yeah, I will thank you, Greg, for your insight, because you have so much knowledge about aviation, and it's so great you have time to share it with all our viewers. And you also share this with our channels as well. Mm-hmm. So thank you a lot for killing me.
I wouldn't say that. I'll add. I mean, I really appreciate this opportunity. So thanks to Andrew for setting this up. I know this stuff isn't trivial, and in fact, I literally don't know how to do it. So thanks to Andrew for making this happen. And thanks to Magnar for showing up. I cannot tell you how many people, talk the game, and there's so many big YouTube channels, and they say so many ridiculous things about aviation, and then you send them a thing going, "Hey, let's debate," and and it's nothing but crickets. Um, there's some YouTube channels I'm really strongly against. I mean, I'm happy that Magnar, stepped up to the plate here and came into this discussion. And Magnar's channel is fantastic. For those of you who haven't seen it, he has probably the best discussion on YouTube, stretched out over several videos. I don't know if he planned it that way, but dealing with the equal transit theory, which has to do with the way wings create lift. And it's a theory that's wrong. And Magnar proves without beyond a shadow of a doubt that the theory is wrong. My favorite video on the one is where he basically tells Neil deGrasse Tyson that Tyson needs to stay in his lane, focus on black holes and whatever else he talks about. This is a mistake that the super intellectuals, I'll just take it for granted that I'm just going to grant that Neil deGrasse Tyson is what I'm going to call a super intellectual. These people tend to assume that because they're really smart in one area of science, they just know everything, and they don't. And he said some stuff that was just flat out incorrect about the way airplanes fly, and Magnar has a great video smacking that down, but a number of other great videos, and I really encourage you to watch Magnar's channel. He's undoubtedly one of the most experienced pilots in the world. Retired. You retired off the ATR, I believe, which is that right?
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
retiring from flying. I'm still instructing, so
Right.
it
Right.
keeps me busy. Yeah, I flew the aircraft for 25 years.
Yeah. And to be alive after flying a turboprop for 25 years, that takes some real skill. I mean, turboprops have all the in the terminal area where accidents tend to happen. They have all the performance of jet aircraft, maybe more, and with a lot more complexity. It's actually really hard to be a captain on a turboprop airplane, and the ATR is a very complicated airplane. Apparently, it's a good airplane. I've never flown it, but yeah. So thanks to Magnar, I think you should check out his channel. Also, Andrew is doing God's work over there on his channel. He's doing interviews with a lot of World War II aviation vets. All these guys are up near 100 years old, and Andrew's getting really great information out of them, very often weeks before they pass away. It's a fantastic channel. I think we're probably all dealing with the AI slop infringing into this space quite a bit, and does sort of annoy me when one of these AI slop channels takes snippets of one of these interviews and makes it into a video that gets tons of views. It drives me crazy. But Andrew's doing great work on his channel. So is Magnar, and I really appreciate you guys showing up for this. I wouldn't even call this a debate; it turned into more of a discussion. I think Magnar and I agree on pretty much everything at this point, except maybe some of the. You can always get into the weight of effect. Just how much effect did Lilienthal have on the Wrights? Yes, some. How much effect did Chanute have? Yes, some. I mean, we might disagree about the amount, but I think we're pretty much in harmony on the big picture stuff. So that's all I've
Yeah.
got. I really appreciate everybody watching this, and thanks again to you two guys. Andrew, what do you got?
Oh, you guys did great. Good job. I'm gonna end it here, but thank you.